Okay, this will be the last set of lecture notes for colonization. Um, as far as what we have left in this unit, that's going to take place primarily in class. We're going to do activities of mercantilism and slavery and social mobility. But as far as colonization, getting the colony started and getting off to a right track this semester, this is the last of the lecture New notes England in Unit to 1. The colony of Georgia. Now, we already looked at a lot of New England through the Puritans, primarily Massachusetts and Rhode Island, when Roger Williams went and founded the colony of Rhode Island after he descended. This is going to be the finishing up of New England, the rest of New England. Connecticut is going to be one of the first colonies to come about. It's originally going to be called the River Colony, primarily because of the massive river that runs, the Hartford or the Connecticut River that runs through it, as well as being surrounded by the Hudson on the other side. It was organized March 3rd, 1636, and it was a safe haven for Puritan noblemen. Nobles in England that were Puritans, very much like the original Puritans, wanted to escape religious persecution, so they came to Connecticut. James I granted the Earl of Warwick the right to settle the area west of the Narragansett Bay, and Warwick gave this grant to 15 Puritan lords as a refuge. So again, we have this concept here of religious freedom or escaping religious persecution. But as always, keep in mind exactly what that reality is, what that religious freedom actually implies. These patentees made John Winthrop Jr., the son of John Winthrop, who you read, A Model of Christian Charity, by. They made his son, Jr., the governor of Connecticut. This would be a picture of him here. Now, upon creating Connecticut, the founders are actually going to draft a government the first constitution written in the Western tradition, as you can see by here, not the Mayflower Compact, but this, the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. It's adopted on January 14, 1638 or 39 CE, depending on how you're looking at it. Has features of a written constitution, which is why it's considered such, which brings us to Connecticut's namesake or nickname, the Constitution State. All right. So if you're ever trying to keep that, in your brain as to how that works, just remember con. All right. Constitution, C-O-N, Connecticut, C-O-N. It's one of the few states that actually has that. It should be able to help you kind of remember it. But this new constitution is going to give men more voting rights and open up more office positions to them, much so than the prior Puritans and the settlers in Jamestown. Now, Puritan and Native American relations, keep in mind in New England right now it's primarily a Puritan settlement. First off, the Puritans are going to bring in epidemics. Native Americans do not have the resiliency to diseases that these Europeans had. And like I said, many of these are going to be wiped out. But it is going to have some uneasy tensions, up and downs, just like we talked about with the Jamestown settlers. For instance, in 1621, we're actually going to have that Thanksgiving recognition, which is going to take place in 1863 by Abraham Lincoln, where they're going to see this coming together and working together festival. But as more settlers came in, that meant that more space was needed west. And what does that mean? Expansion, right? Expansion where? Into Native American territory, which always equals more fighting. All right. Now, keep in mind the Puritans are Calvinists and they see themselves as God elect, and what they do is kind of God's mission. If God were not pleased with our inheriting these parts, why doth he still make room for us by diminishing them as we increase? All right. They justify their expansion and their killing of Indians through the use of God. This is going to lead to the Pequot Wars, 1636 and 1637, Common Era. The Pequots were a native tribe that lived in the area. Pequots fought with the invading settlers, and in 1636, a Puritan militia is going to attack a Pequot camp. Or when we think of camp, think of it like the small Indian domain. But in this attack, they're going to kill 500 men, women, and children. A Puritan militiaman stated, God laughed at the enemies of the people, filling the place with dead bodies. Which brings in those and that justification that what they were doing was godly and right. This is going to lead to King Phillps War in 1675 to 76, another huge conflict between the Puritan settlements, the settlers, and the Native Americans. You had King Philip, who was actually Chief Metacom. They referred to him as King Philip. He was the leader of the Wampanoags, known as King Philip by the English. Like I said, often they would give English names to Indians to, you could almost just say, recognize them. King Philip wants the Indians to unite and fight settlers. He wants all the tribes to come together and resist this foreign invasion. He's tired of observing Puritan laws, which is one of the things that Puritans would do when they took over an area. They would make everyone conform, so even natives had to be Puritan. Again, the reality of religious freedom, Puritan freedom. King Philip began a war, hit-and-run tactics. He burned outlying settlements throughout New England for over a year. This lasted a really long time. But food shortage, disease, and casualties eventually wore the natives down. More and more white settlers showed up, and the natives could not keep up. This is going to cause massive losses to Indian life. Metacom eventually is going to be caught, beheaded, and drawn and quartered, which is pretty nasty stuff. His head is going to be put on display in Plymouth. Now, the results after King Philip's War and all this immigration into the new area, this new settlement, Native American power is going to absolutely cease in the New England area for good. That's what King Philip's War actually does. That's the long term, is Native American power ceases. It's pretty much over. 1/10 of colonial men are actually going to die in this. However, more are going to come. All right. Now, in King Philip's War, a lot of men were dead. A lot of lives were lost. 1/10 of the men. That's a higher proportion when you look at the population statistics than the American Revolution or the Civil War. But as you can see, it's going to grow. As the years progress along the chart here, the population of the whites go up, and the population of the natives go down. African Americans stay the same, but you can kind of see a small rise in population down here, a little bit of an influx through slavery, indentured servitude, and just free blacks migrating to the area. Okay, well, over time, the Massachusetts Charter is going to be revoked. Essentially what happens is Massachusetts starts to be very largely incorporated into trade. They started trading large quantities of commerce. Traders and stockholders in England decided that they would like the colony to come under the domain of the empire directly, so that they could capitalize on certain aspects of the trade, make it more heavily involved in England's trade, and also just kind of consolidate the empire overall. King James II is actually going to be the king that does this. He does it in 1685. And when he does this, when he revokes the Massachusetts Charter, it's no longer owned and operated by the Massachusetts Bay Company. It is now a royal colony with its own royal governor. So keep that in mind. All right. What James is going to do is he's actually going to consolidate the entire New England area, though. He's going to consolidate Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, the colony of religious freedom, into one. It's going to be called the Dominion of New England, which is where we get the phrase today when we refer to that part of the country as New England. Let's talk a bit about the mid-Atlantic colonies. New York, which today we know is one of our biggest states with the biggest populations, is settled by the Dutch originally, and it's going to be called New Netherlands. It's named primarily after where they came from. Manhattan, or what we know today as Manhattan, is going to be called New Amsterdam, named after the major city of where they came from. In 1664, the British are going to conquer it and rename it New York after lands in England, which is where we get the term today when we refer to New York. That's why it's not New Amsterdam today. New York's going to be an interesting colony, though. It's going to have religious toleration, and the Dutch are actually going to be invited to stay, and many of them will actually do so. A little bit about how Peter Stuyvesant was a Dutch director at the time, but he wasn't very popular. He didn't govern his people probably in the best way. He gave out a call to raise arms against the British, where the British were moving in on the territory, but this is just going to be largely ignored because people had had enough of him, and he's going to surrender the entire colony without a shot. Pennsylvania is another story, though. William Penn led the Quakers on sort of an expedition into the area. He moved into what we now know today as Pennsylvania, and he bought the land, okay? Emphasis on bought the land, because you remember the Puritans, when we talked about them, and the Jamestown colonists, when they wanted land, they took it. They just kept expanding, and it was rather violent. Penn does something different here. He actually buys the land. He doesn't take the land from the Indians, which goes back into this Quaker mentality of being very pacifist, or not warlike, you could say. They're not very aggressive. In 1681, he receives a grant from the king to form his own colony, which is what we know today as Pennsylvania, names it after himself. Free worship to all in Pennsylvania. Quakers, Puritans, it didn't matter. Anybody could come, anybody could worship in Pennsylvania. He also offered social equality, and one of the things that's interesting about this early colony, maybe William Penn was ahead of his time, and you can't really see it down here, I'm sorry, but Pennsylvania establishes a premise of no slavery. So it's going to be a slave-free state, one of the first. New Jersey and Delaware are going to come after Pennsylvania, and they're very much going to be modeled after Pennsylvania. They're very similar to it. Delaware is actually going to be controlled by Pennsylvania up until about the American Revolution, and we know them here today is right there on the coastline. Which brings us to the southern colonies. Now, we already talked about Virginia and the settlement of Jamestown, so we can kind of move on from there. Maryland comes about a little bit later after the Carolinas, or excuse me, a little bit later after the settlement of Virginia, and kind of bridges the gap in between the two. The Carolinas and Georgia are also going to come about at this time, and this is where you're going to have those southern agricultural economies start to emerge. The Carolinas are originally, they're named after King Charles II. The initial settlement at South Carolina is actually named after Charles. We know it today as Charleston, but back then it was referred to as Charlestown after the king, King Charles. In 1670, English settlers from the West Indies settled the area. They go right in. They tried to kill the Savannah Indians, but those Indians are actually going to remain very well entrenched in this area here, and James Oglethorpe's going to have to deal with them later on when he settles Georgia. But South Carolina is going to become a major southern port. The town of Charlestown, keep in mind that there is a separation here. Charlestown, South Carolina becomes a major southern port. They export rice, but they need lots of slaves to cultivate this large crop. So slavery is going to be on the rise in South Carolina. Indigo is also going to be exported from here. Indigo is a crop that was used for dye for clothes to add them color. In 1712, North Carolina is going to split from South Carolina, made up primarily of religious dissenters and others that did not need slaves. But when we get up to the Civil War, we know that that kind of reverses itself, and North Carolina does eventually embrace slavery. Georgia is actually the last colony of the 13. Founded in 1733 by James Oglethorpe. It was named after King George III, and it was founded as a buffer against the Spanish-controlled Florida. So if you see here, you got Spain down here, heavily entrenched in Florida. Oglethorpe comes into this area right here to provide a military buffer zone between Florida and these very lucrative agricultural areas in the Carolinas. They were trying to keep the Spanish out. Savannah also, in its own right, is going to become a major port that's going to be an object of desire for the British in the Revolution. Now, we didn't spend a lot of time on them, but just to kind of briefly sum up, the French are entrenched in North America as well. They founded the colony of Quebec. Like its European rival Great Britain, which is what it basically says here in this short description, they wanted these colonies for natural resources to bring back to France and to use. Quebec is going to be that first French colony, the first permanent, keyword on permanent, first permanent French settlement in North America. The French instructed their colonists to spread the Catholic faith in the New World, much like the English are going to be spreading Protestantism. So right here, you're going to have that kind of Protestantism versus Catholicism conflict that happened in Europe. The French are going to be a little bit more, but the French are going to have better relations with the natives because they really just established contact for the fur trade. So you need to keep that in mind, what the big French ideal was here, the fur trade, because they could take that back, sell it in France for very high prices, which meant that the Indians were more open to embrace their trade and to embrace Catholicism. All right, and this is our general outlook of the colonies going up into 1774, and keep in mind this is just 2 years before we signed our Declaration of Independence in 1776. So you've got the British 13 colonies going down the coast. Spain is heavily entrenched in Florida, and they're going to remain so for a good long time. And if you looked at the province of Quebec, it's generally right here. Now, on this map, it's actually owned by the British when the British take it after the French and Indian War. But this is your general outlook. This is what it would have looked like. This was the controlled French territory. Okay, keep in mind, these notes are on the class materials page. You can go back, you can look at those, you can print them off and take notes on notes. Make sure you rewatch the video before